May 18, 1936, Leuna, Germany. Outside, the morning looks ordinary, quiet, industrial, unremarkable. But inside one of the largest chemical facilities on Earth, something is happening that directly contradicts what most scientists once believed was possible. Next to an industrial reactor, the thermometer reads 427 degrees Celsius. The air vibrates with heat. Inside pressure vessels the size of railway locomotives, brown coal and hydrogen are being forced into a transformation that a British admiral once described as chemically impossible. High-octane aviation fuel. The pressure gauge climbs to 300 atmospheres, more than 4,400 pounds per square inch, enough pressure to crush ordinary steel like paper if the reactor walls were not nearly 3 inches thick. Workers in heat-resistant suits move slowly along the platform, watching flow rates, temperatures, and pressure levels. There is no margin for error here. Every 6 hours, another ton of lignite, cheap brown coal excavated from mines 50 kilometers away, is fed into the system, mixed with heavy oil recycled from earlier runs of the same process. Inside the reactor, molecular bonds begin to fail. Massive carbon structures, locked for millions of years inside rigid crystalline coal, are being shattered apart. Hydrogen atoms are being driven into positions they would never occupy under natural conditions. What geology normally requires millions of years to accomplish deep underground is being forced to happen in mere hours inside red-hot steel reactors. At the output end of the system, a clear liquid flows into collection tanks. Not petroleum, not crude oil drilled from underground wells. This is synthetic fuel, created entirely from coal, water, and electricity. The Nazi regime calls it ersatz fuel, substitute fuel, but there is nothing inferior about it. This liquid will propel Luftwaffe fighters beyond 400 miles per hour. It will drive armored Panzer divisions across Europe. It will keep U-boats submerged for weeks at a time. And yet, Germany has almost no oil of its own. The entire nation produces barely 50,000 barrels of crude oil per year, enough to run the German economy for less than 3 days. And still, by 1944, Germany will be producing 124,000 barrels of fuel every single day. Not from oil fields, not from overseas colonies, but from coal. 25 massive industrial plants like Leuna will turn a country with no meaningful petroleum reserves into a fully mechanized war machine capable of fighting a modern industrial war for 6 years, long after every strategic calculation said it should have collapsed from fuel starvation. So the question is not whether the technology worked. The question is this: how did a chemical invention created in 1913 allow Germany to fight a total war without a single oil well of strategic importance? The technology that kept Germany fighting did not begin with the Nazis. It did not begin with war. It began 23 years earlier, in 1913, with a German chemist almost no one outside academic circles had heard of. His name was Friedrich Bergius. Friedrich Karl Rudolf Bergius was born on October 11, 1884, near Breslau in what was then the German Empire. He did not grow up surrounded by laboratories or lecture halls. Before studying chemistry, his father insisted he spend 6 months working in a steel factory. The goal was simple. Before touching theory, Bergius had to understand industrial reality. Heat, noise, pressure, failure. Only after that experience was he allowed to pursue academic chemistry. Bergius studied at the University of Breslau beginning in 1903. He moved quickly, too quickly, some said. By 1907, after just 4 years, he earned a PhD in chemistry from the University of Leipzig. His doctoral work focused on sulfuric acid as a solvent. Competent, technically sound, but unremarkable. Nothing about it suggested he would one day redefine industrial chemistry. That changed during his habilitation, the postdoctoral qualification required to become a professor in Germany. Between 1909 and 1913, at the Technical University of Hanover, Bergius became obsessed with a question most chemists considered already answered. Could solid coal be converted directly into liquid fuel? The obvious answer was no. Coal is a solid, built from enormous aromatic molecules locked into rigid structures. Petroleum is a liquid, made of much smaller hydrocarbon chains. Yes, both originate from ancient organic matter, but chemically they are worlds apart. Turning coal into liquid fuel would require breaking massive molecules into smaller ones, a process known as pyrolysis. At the same time, hydrogen atoms would need to be added to stabilize those fragments, hydrogenation. Both reactions were known individually. Doing them simultaneously in a controlled way was another matter entirely. The required conditions were extreme. Temperatures of 400 to 500 degrees Celsius were achievable, but the pressures, 200 to 700 atmospheres, were considered completely impractical. In 1913, no industrial equipment on Earth was believed capable of sustaining such pressures at such temperatures continuously without catastrophic failure. The chemistry might be theoretically possible. The engineering, everyone agreed, was not. Bergius disagreed. Instead of accepting the limitations of existing equipment, he chose a different approach. He would build new equipment, capable of operating where chemistry textbooks said industry could not go. During his habilitation, Bergius developed entirely new methods for conducting high-pressure, high-temperature reactions involving carbon-based materials. Not on paper, not in theory, but in steel. In 1913, his work resulted in a patent for a process that described something unprecedented: the direct hydrogenation of coal into liquid hydrocarbons. German Patent 301231, filed on August 9, 1913. At the time, few understood what it would eventually become. But that single document would quietly lay the foundation for one of the most strategically important industrial technologies of the 20th century. Bergius's patent did not describe a miracle. It described a process, a brutal, violent process that forced chemistry to behave in ways it never would on its own. At the core of the Bergius process was a simple idea. If coal and petroleum were chemically related, then coal could be broken apart and rebuilt into liquid fuel. But doing that required absolute control over conditions most factories could not even approach. The process began with dry coal, finely ground into powder. Particle size mattered. Too large and reactions stalled. Too small and the material clogged pumps and pipes. This powdered coal was mixed with heavy oil, recycled from earlier runs of the same system. The oil was not a solvent in the traditional sense. It was a carrier, turning solid coal into a thick, pumpable slurry. A catalyst was added. In the earliest versions, it was nothing more than iron sulfide, already present in the coal itself. The mixture was then pumped into a reactor and subjected to conditions that bordered on insanity for the early 20th century. Temperatures between 400 and 500 degrees Celsius, hydrogen pressures ranging from 200 to 700 atmospheres. Inside the reactor, everything happened at once. The heat shattered coal's massive aromatic structures. Large molecules broke apart into smaller fragments. At the same time, hydrogen atoms forced their way into those fragments, stabilizing them before they could recombine into useless tar. This was not slow chemistry. It was violent, exothermic, and difficult to control. But it worked. Out of the reactor came a mixture of liquid hydrocarbons, synthetic petroleum created directly from lignite brown coal. In chemical terms, the reaction could be summarized simply. Large coal-based hydrocarbons plus hydrogen produced smaller hydrocarbon chains along with byproducts. In practice, it took Bergius years to fully understand what was happening at the molecular level. What mattered was that the reaction was reproducible. It was reliable. Bergius filed patents not only in Germany, but also in Britain and France. The scientific community was impressed. Industry was not. In 1913, petroleum was cheap and abundant. The Texas oil boom was just beginning. Persian oil fields were coming online. Russian production in Baku was expanding rapidly. Why invest millions into a dangerous, complex, and expensive method of making fuel from coal when natural petroleum cost a fraction of the price? From a purely economic perspective, the Bergius process made no sense. So for years, it remained a technological curiosity, admired by chemists, ignored by investors. The world already had oil. No one yet understood how fragile that assumption would turn out to be. The answer arrived not through chemistry, but through war. When World War I began in 1914, Germany did not lack scientists or factories. It lacked something far more basic: access. The British naval blockade cut Germany off from global trade routes almost immediately. Oil imports slowed, then stopped. Raw materials became strategic weapons. Suddenly, petroleum was no longer just an economic commodity. It was a matter of national survival. That same year, Carl Goldschmidt, owner of T.H. Goldschmidt AG, later part of what would become Evonik Industries, invited Friedrich Bergius to build an industrial-scale version of his coal hydrogenation process. Production was supposed to begin quickly. It never did. The war consumed everything. Steel went to weapons. Engineers were drafted. Capital vanished. Partially built facilities sat idle while the German economy strained under total mobilization. By the time the war ended in 1918, the plant was still unfinished, and Germany had lost. The Treaty of Versailles transformed military defeat into economic catastrophe. Germany was stripped of territory, colonies, and access to foreign resources. Massive reparations drained what little capital remained. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Foreign exchange became almost impossible to obtain. And critically, Germany's ability to purchase oil on the international market was now tightly constrained. Petroleum imports were no longer just expensive, they were politically vulnerable. Oil-producing nations could restrict supply to enforce compliance with treaty terms. Every tanker became a bargaining chip. The leaders of the newly formed Weimar Republic understood the danger. Germany had something few other nations possessed: centuries' worth of coal. Lignite, hard brown coal, bituminous coal, anthracite. What it did not have was oil. Turning coal into liquid fuel was still far more expensive than importing petroleum, but cost was no longer the decisive factor. Security was. Between 1919 and 1925, the German government quietly began financing research into coal conversion technologies. Synthetic fuel was no longer viewed as an industrial curiosity. It was a strategic necessity. For Bergius, these years were brutal. Inflation destroyed investment. Industrial scale-up proved far more difficult than laboratory experiments, and public criticism mounted. Another prominent chemist, Franz Fischer, along with Hans Tropsch, promoted an alternative method for producing fuel from coal, one that would later bear their names. Fischer publicly dismissed Bergius's approach as inefficient and impractical. By 1925, Friedrich Bergius was nearly bankrupt. The man who had solved an impossible chemical problem could not solve an economic one. Left with no alternatives, Bergius sold his patents to BASF. To most, it looked like the end of his story. In reality, it was just the beginning. BASF was not an ordinary chemical company. It possessed something Bergius never had: capital, engineering depth, and experience operating processes at extreme pressures. At BASF, Bergius's work caught the attention of Carl Bosch, the chemist who had already transformed industrial chemistry once before. Bosch was a co-inventor of the Haber-Bosch process, which turned atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia and had reshaped global agriculture and warfare. Bosch immediately recognized the significance of Bergius's ideas. The chemistry was sound. The problem had never been the reaction, it was scale. With BASF's resources, the Bergius process moved out of experimental reactors and into full industrial development. On April 1, 1927, a new facility began operation at Luna. It was the first commercial-scale synthetic fuel plant in history. For the first time, liquid fuel was being produced in meaningful quantities, not from oil wells, but from coal, day after day, under controlled conditions. The plant was not efficient, it was not cheap, but it worked. By the early 1930s, Luna was producing fuel that met commercial standards. Other facilities were already being planned. In 1931, Friedrich Bergius received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, sharing the award with Carl Bosch. The citation honored their contributions to the invention and development of high-pressure chemical methods. The Nobel Committee recognized something critical. Bergius and Bosch had pushed industrial chemistry beyond limits previously thought unsafe, uncontrollable, or economically impossible. By then, synthetic fuel was no longer a theoretical concept, it was a proven industrial reality. Still, in peacetime, the economics remained unfavorable. Synthetic fuel cost 3 to 4 times more than imported petroleum. Without a compelling reason to accept that cost, large-scale expansion would never have happened. That reason arrived in 1936. On October 18th, Adolf Hitler announced the 4-year plan, placing Hermann Göring in charge of transforming Germany into a self-sufficient war economy. The goal was explicit. Germany would prepare for war by eliminating dependence on foreign resources, especially oil and rubber. Coal liquefaction was no longer an option. It became a national priority. What had begun as an academic obsession in 1913 was about to be weaponized on an unprecedented scale. By the mid-1930s, Germany's fuel problem was no longer theoretical. The country consumed roughly 85,000 barrels of petroleum per day. Domestic oil production provided less than 1,000 of those barrels. The rest came from imports, paid for with scarce foreign currency and entirely dependent on political stability. If war began, those imports would vanish almost overnight. German planners calculated that existing reserves would last 6 months at best. After that, mechanized warfare would grind to a halt. Tanks without fuel were immobile steel boxes. Aircraft without aviation gasoline never left the ground. Ships without diesel stayed in port. Under the 4-year plan, the German state poured enormous resources into synthetic fuel. By 1939, 7 hydrogenation plants using the Burgess process were operating. They were producing tens of thousands of barrels of synthetic petrol every day. Expansion accelerated. By 1943, Germany operated 20 synthetic fuel plants, producing approximately 115,000 barrels per day. By 1944, the number rose to 25 plants, with output peaking at 124,000 barrels per day. To put that figure in perspective, Germany had effectively created the equivalent of a medium-sized oil field, entirely through chemistry. 1/3 of Burgess-based production came from plants at Lona, Politz, and Police, with the remainder distributed across 5 additional major facilities. The Lona complex alone covered nearly 3 square miles, contained more than 250 buildings, and employed 35,000 workers. It was the largest synthetic fuel plant in the world. It was also one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Europe. As production expanded, the complexity of the process became impossible to ignore. Coal liquefaction was not a single reaction. It was a vast, continuous industrial system, one that demanded precision at every stage. Any disruption risked shutting down the entire operation, and shutting it down was far easier than restarting it. Germany had achieved fuel independence, but it had also created a new kind of vulnerability.
From the outside, the Burgess process sounded deceptively simple. Heat coal, add hydrogen, apply pressure. The reality was a tightly balanced industrial system where failure at any stage could cripple the entire plant. The process began with coal preparation. Raw coal was crushed, finely ground, and dried in streams of hot gas. Moisture had to be removed completely. Even small amounts of water reduced reaction efficiency and increased corrosion. Particle size was critical. Too coarse and chemical reactions slowed dramatically. Too fine and the powder clogged pumps, valves, and pipelines. Next came mixing. The dry coal powder was blended with heavy oil recycled from previous production cycles. This oil served as a transport medium, turning solid coal into a thick, pumpable slurry. The ratio had to be precise. Too much coal and the mixture became too viscous to move. Too little and production efficiency dropped. A catalyst was added. Early plants relied on iron sulfide naturally present in the coal. Later facilities introduced tungsten and molybdenum sulfides, dramatically improving reaction efficiency and fuel quality. Then came pressurization. The coal-oil catalyst slurry was forced into massive pressure vessels. Pumping this viscous material against pressures exceeding 200 atmospheres required enormous steam-driven pumps. These machines operated continuously and required constant maintenance. A single pump failure could shut down an entire production line. Inside the reactor, the core reaction occurred. Temperatures rose to 400 to 500 degrees Celsius. Hydrogen pressure climbed as high as 700 atmospheres. At these conditions, coal's aromatic molecular structures fractured apart. At the same time, hydrogen atoms bonded to the fragments, stabilizing them before they could recombine into tar or coke. The reactions released heat. Left uncontrolled, that heat could trigger thermal runaway, destroying reactors and killing workers. Precise temperature control was not optional. It was the difference between production and catastrophe. After reaction, the output flowed into separation units. The mixture contained gasoline-range hydrocarbons, diesel fractions, heavy oils, unreacted coal residue, and various byproducts. Distillation towers separated these fractions by boiling point.
The lighter products moved on to refining, where sulfur, nitrogen, and other impurities were removed. Some fractions were sent through additional hydrogenation steps for further upgrading. The heaviest oils were recycled back into the system, mixed with fresh coal and processed again. Finally, there was the problem of hydrogen. The entire process consumed enormous quantities of it, roughly 80 kilograms of hydrogen per ton of dry, ash-free coal. Hydrogen was produced through coal gasification and steam reforming. Dedicated hydrogen plants became essential components of every synthetic fuel facility. By modern standards, the process was wildly inefficient. It took 4 to 5 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of liquid fuel. Most of the energy was lost as waste heat or consumed simply keeping the plant running. From a strategic perspective, none of that mattered. Coal was abundant, oil was not. A 4-to-1 ratio was acceptable if the alternative was no fuel at all. The Burgius process worked, but it was not the only path Germany pursued.
While Friedrich Bergius focused on direct coal liquefaction, other German chemists were pursuing a fundamentally different idea. Instead of forcing coal directly into liquid form, they asked a different question. What if coal was first turned into a gas and only then converted into fuel? At the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Coal Research, chemists Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch developed what became known as the Fischer-Tropsch process. Patented in 1925, it took an indirect route to the same destination. The first step was gasification. Coal was reacted with steam and oxygen at temperatures exceeding 900 degrees Celsius. The solid coal was transformed into synthesis gas, a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. This step destroyed coal's original structure completely. Next came gas cleanup. Sulfur compounds, tar, and particulates were removed. The ratio of carbon monoxide to hydrogen was carefully adjusted to optimize downstream reactions. Only then did the actual fuel synthesis begin. The clean synthesis gas flowed into reactors containing iron, cobalt, or nickel catalysts. Temperatures were far lower than in the Bergius process, between 150 and 300 degrees Celsius, and pressures rarely exceeded 20 atmospheres. Under these conditions, carbon monoxide and hydrogen recombined into long-chain hydrocarbons. The output was different. Where Bergius plants produced large amounts of gasoline-range fuel, Fischer-Tropsch produced primarily diesel and kerosene, ideal for submarines, heavy vehicles, and aircraft. By the early 1940s, Fischer-Tropsch technology had matured. It was more efficient and less mechanically extreme than direct coal hydrogenation. But it had one limitation. The world still ran on gasoline. Germany needed both. By 1944, Germany operated 9 Fischer-Tropsch plants, complementing 12 hydrogenation plants using the Bergius process. Together, the two technologies gave Germany something no other major power possessed: near total independence from natural petroleum. By 1943, almost half of Germany's fuel came from synthetic sources. By 1945, that figure exceeded 75%. From a technological standpoint, the system was a triumph. From a strategic standpoint, it created a dangerous illusion. Because these plants were enormous, centralized, impossible to hide. And once Allied planners realized that synthetic fuel was Germany's true lifeline, everything changed. For years, Allied bombing strategy focused on cities, railways, and aircraft factories. The results were devastating, but not decisive. Germany continued to fight.
Then analysts noticed something different. German aircraft were flying fewer missions. Tank divisions were training less. Naval operations were increasingly restricted. The problem was not manpower, it was fuel. By 1943, Allied intelligence identified synthetic fuel plants as Germany's single most critical industrial dependency. Unlike dispersed factories, these complexes were massive, centralized, and irreplaceable. There were no substitutes. In May 1944, the Allies launched a systematic campaign against synthetic fuel production. The targets were clear: Leuna, Perlitz, Blechhammer, Lütgendorf, Berlin. Wave after wave of bombers attacked hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch plants with precision previously reserved for aircraft factories. The effects were immediate. In April 1944, synthetic fuel production stood at roughly 175,000 barrels per day. By July, output collapsed to less than 40,000 barrels per day. By September, it fell below 10,000. The reason was not destruction alone. Synthetic fuel plants were extraordinarily fragile. A single destroyed compressor could halt hydrogen flow. A damaged distillation column could shut down an entire facility. A severed power line stopped everything. Repairs required specialized steel, custom valves, and highly trained technicians, all in short supply. Each restart took weeks, sometimes months. As fuel disappeared, the German war machine began to suffocate. The Luftwaffe grounded pilots to conserve aviation gasoline. Tank units abandoned vehicles during retreats. Training programs were canceled. Experienced pilots died because they could not practice. New pilots entered combat with almost no flight hours. By early 1945, Germany was producing aircraft faster than it could fuel them. The factories still stood. The planes still rolled out, but they stayed on the ground. In the end, coal liquefaction did not fail because the chemistry was flawed. It failed because centralized chemistry cannot survive decentralized destruction. What had once been Germany's greatest technological advantage became its most critical weakness. The war ended not when Germany ran out of machines, but when it ran out of fuel.